The words hit me like ice water across the face. Maybe if you weren't so poor, Emma, you'd understand why some people actually deserve nice things. Brittany Thompson, my ex-husband's new wife, stood there in her designer heels and perfectly blown-out hair, holding a latte that probably cost more than my lunch budget for the week. Her smile was sweet as artificial sugar, and twice as bitter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have walked away. Any reasonable person would have turned around and left Bloom Cafe without another word. But something about the way she said it, the casual cruelty wrapped in fake concern, made me plant my feet on that polished concrete floor and smile right back at her. "You know what, Brittany?" I said, my voice calm despite the fire burning in my chest. "You're absolutely right. Some people do deserve nice things." 6 months ago, I never would have imagined I'd be standing in the most expensive cafe in Riverside Hills, Colorado, face to face with the woman who had destroyed my marriage. Not because she was some irresistible temptress who had stolen my husband's heart, but because she represented everything Jake Thompson had always wanted me to be, and everything I had refused to become. My name is Emma Martinez, and up until 18 months ago, I thought I had a pretty good life. I was 35, working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized tech company in Denver, living in a cozy townhouse in Valley Creek, and married to Jake Thompson, a man I'd met in college and loved for over a decade. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had plans. We talked about starting a family, maybe buying a bigger house in a few years, taking that trip to Europe we'd been saving for since our wedding. What I didn't know was that while I was contentedly building our modest life together, Jake was already planning his exit strategy. The signs were there, of course. They always are. The late nights at the office that stretched later and later. The way he'd started dressing better, spending more money on clothes and cologne. The sudden interest in expensive restaurants and exclusive events. The way he'd look at our townhouse with barely concealed disgust, making comments about how cramped it felt and how we needed to upgrade our lifestyle. I attributed it to career ambition. Jake had started his own real estate development company 3 years into our marriage, and I knew he was working hard to establish himself in Riverside Hills' competitive market. The man I married had been driven but down to earth, someone who appreciated simple pleasures and genuine connections. I thought the changes were just growing pains, the natural evolution of a man building a business. I was wrong about almost everything. The truth started unraveling on a Thursday evening in March, when Jake came home later than usual, his tie loosened and his expression carefully neutral. I was in the kitchen making dinner, humming along to music while I chopped vegetables for our favorite pasta dish. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind of domestic scene that had defined our marriage for years. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, and those 4 words drained all the warmth from the room. I set down my knife and turned to face him, already knowing from his tone that whatever came next would change everything. Jake had never been good at difficult conversations. Throughout our marriage, whenever we'd had disagreements or needed to discuss serious topics, he'd always approach them with this same careful distance, like he was delivering a business presentation rather than talking to his wife. "I haven't been happy for a while," he began, and I felt my heart sink into my stomach. "We've grown apart, Emma. We want different things now. I think it's time we consider separating." The words felt surreal, like he was speaking a foreign language. "What do you mean we want different things?" "Jake, we just talked about looking at houses in Willowbrook Estates last month. We've been planning—" "That's exactly what I mean," he interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "You're still thinking small, Emma. You're content with planning and saving and waiting for someday. I can't live like that anymore. I need more." More. That word would echo in my head for months afterward. More than our home, more than our life together, more than me. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal in their efficiency. Jake had clearly been preparing for this conversation much longer than I'd realized. He had documentation, financial records, and a lawyer who specialized in protecting assets during dissolution of marriage. What should have been a fair split of everything we'd built together became a masterclass in how someone you trust can systematically dismantle your life while maintaining legal innocence. Jake kept the house. Technically, he bought out my half, but at a valuation that was suspiciously low, conducted by an appraiser who happened to be a close friend of his business partner. The car, which we'd purchased together but was in his name for insurance reasons, stayed with him. Our joint savings account, which had taken us years to build, was divided according to a complex formula his lawyer had devised that somehow left me with less than a third of what I'd contributed. By the time everything was finalized, I found myself starting over at 34 with a modest settlement, no home, and the growing realization that the man I'd loved and trusted had been systematically preparing to leave me with as little as possible while protecting himself from any financial inconvenience. I rented a small townhouse in Valley Creek, a perfectly respectable middle-class neighborhood that felt like a prison sentence after the dreams Jake and I had shared. The walls were thin, the kitchen was cramped, and every morning I woke up to the reality that this was my new life. Smaller, lonelier, and infinitely more uncertain than anything I'd imagined. But the real blow came 3 months after our divorce was finalized, when Jake's engagement announcement appeared on social media. Brittany Williams was everything I wasn't. 28 years old, blonde, perpetually tanned, with the kind of effortless beauty that looked natural but clearly required significant time and money to maintain. She was an influencer, though I had to look up what that actually meant. Apparently, she made a living posting photos of herself living an aspirational lifestyle, promoting products, and sharing motivational quotes about manifesting your dreams. Her Instagram account, Living My Best Life, had over 150,000 followers who regularly liked and commented on photos of her in designer outfits, eating at expensive restaurants, and posing in locations that screamed luxury and exclusivity. Every post was perfectly curated, every caption carefully crafted to project an image of someone who had life figured out and was generous enough to share the secrets with her devoted audience. The engagement photos were taken at Riverside Hills Country Club, with Brittany wearing a ring that was easily 3 times the size of the modest diamond Jake had given me. They looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, all perfect smiles and expensive clothes and that particular glow that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I stared at those photos for longer than was healthy, studying every detail and trying to understand how Jake had moved so seamlessly from our life together to this glossy new existence. The man in those pictures looked like Jake, but he was wearing clothes I'd never seen, standing in places we'd never been together, holding a woman who represented everything our marriage had never been. The wedding, 6 months later, was the social event of the season in Riverside Hills. I didn't attend, obviously, but it was impossible to avoid the coverage. Brittany documented every moment on her social media accounts. From the bridal shower at the country club, to the bachelorette party in Napa Valley, to the ceremony itself, which was held at the historic Riverside Hills Theater, and featured arrangements that probably cost more than my annual rent. Jake looked happy in the photos. Not just satisfied or content, but genuinely radiant in a way I'd never seen during our marriage. It was the kind of happiness that comes from finally getting everything you've ever wanted, and it made me wonder if he'd ever felt that way about me, even in the beginning. The newlyweds moved into a massive house in Willowbrook Estates, the exclusive neighborhood where we'd once dreamed of living together. The house was a sprawling colonial with a circular driveway, professional landscaping, and enough square footage to house 3 families comfortably. Brittany posted a house tour on her Instagram that accumulated thousands of likes and comments about how blessed she was to be living her dream life. For months after the wedding, I tried to build a life that didn't revolve around what Jake and Brittany were doing. I focused on my job, made new friends, started dating again. I told myself that their happiness had nothing to do with me, that their success wasn't a commentary on my worth, that the comparison game was toxic and pointless. But Riverside Hills is a small town, especially among the social circles that Jake had begun moving in. It was impossible to completely avoid encounters, particularly since his real estate business was booming and Brittany's influence was growing. They were the golden couple, featured in the local magazine's 40 under 40 inches list, and regularly photographed at charity events and social gatherings. I learned to navigate around them, choosing different grocery stores, avoiding restaurants where they might appear, timing my errands to minimize the chances of awkward encounters. It wasn't healthy, but it was survivable. Until that Thursday afternoon in October when I made the mistake of stopping at Bloom Cafe during what I thought was a safe time. I'd been having a particularly difficult week at work, dealing with a demanding client and a campaign that wasn't performing as expected. All I wanted was a quiet hour with my laptop and a decent coffee to try to salvage the project before my afternoon deadline. Bloom Cafe was usually busy during lunch but quieter in the mid-afternoon, and I'd successfully avoided any unpleasant encounters there for months. I was settling into my usual corner table, spreading out my materials and trying to focus on the task at hand, when I heard a voice I recognized but hadn't heard in person for over a year. Emma? Oh my God, Emma Martinez. I looked up to see Brittany Thompson approaching my table with a bright smile and the kind of confident stride that comes from knowing you own every room you enter. She was even more striking in person than in her carefully filtered social media photos, wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and carrying a handbag that I was pretty sure was genuine designer leather. "Brittany," I said, forcing a polite smile and saving my work on my laptop. "How are you?" "I'm amazing! Absolutely amazing!" She gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Do you mind if I sit? I feel like we never really got a chance to talk properly, you know?" Before I could respond, she was already settling into the chair, placing her designer handbag on the table and fixing me with the kind of intense, slightly predatory smile that I'd seen her use in her Instagram videos when she was about to sell something to her followers. "I have to say," she continued, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby tables could hear our conversation, "you look great. Really great. Divorce suits you." The comment was designed to sound like a compliment, but it landed like a subtle slap. There was something in her tone, a carefully calibrated mix of sympathy and superiority, that made it clear she saw me as someone to be pitied rather than respected. "Thank you," I replied carefully. "You look wonderful too. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Oh, it really does." Her laugh was musical but somehow artificial. "Jake is just the most incredible husband. He's so thoughtful, so generous, so focused." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On making sure I have everything I need to be happy. I honestly can't imagine being with anyone else. Every word was a carefully placed needle, designed to remind me of everything I'd lost and everything she'd gained. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt that familiar ache of inadequacy that had haunted me since the divorce. "That's wonderful," I managed. "I'm happy for both of you." "You know, I was just thinking about you the other day," Brittany continued, leaning forward as if she was about to share something confidential. "Jake and I were driving through Valley Creek, and I saw your little townhouse. It's so cute, so perfectly sized for someone in your situation." The way she said "your situation" made it sound like a medical condition. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I kept my voice level. "It works well for me," I said. "I like the neighborhood." "Oh, I'm sure you do. And it's so smart to live within your means. Not everyone can afford the luxury lifestyle, and there's nothing wrong with being practical." She paused to sip her latte, letting the comment sink in. "Jake always says that one of the things he appreciated about you was how low maintenance you were. How you never asked for more than he could give." The insult was so beautifully wrapped in fake praise that it took me a moment to fully process it. Low maintenance. Never asked for more. She was painting me as someone who had been content with less because I couldn't inspire or deserve more. "I believe in being grateful for what I have," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "That's such a beautiful attitude," Brittany exclaimed, as if I'd just shared profound wisdom. "I really admire people who can find happiness in simple things. Not everyone needs designer clothes or expensive vacations or luxury homes to feel fulfilled." She gestured to her own outfit as she spoke, a casual movement that drew attention to the obvious quality and cost of everything she was wearing. It was a masterclass in subtle humiliation, designed to make me feel small and shabby without her having to say anything explicitly cruel. "Some people are just naturally content with less," she continued, her smile never wavering. "It's actually kind of inspiring, in a way. Like, You found a way to be happy even though you can't afford the things that most people consider basic necessities for a good life. I felt my hands clench under the table. The conversation had moved beyond subtle digs into territory that was openly condescending. Brittany was enjoying this, feeding off my discomfort like some kind of emotional vampire. I wouldn't say I can't afford things, I said carefully. I make different choices about how to spend my money. Oh, absolutely, she nodded enthusiastically. And that's so wise. I mean, when you're working in a support role at a smaller company, you have to be really strategic about budgeting. Jake told me about your job at that tech place. It sounds so stable, so reliable. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur or an influencer, right? Someone has to do the regular jobs. Regular jobs. Support role. The words stung because they diminished not just my income, but my entire professional identity. I'd worked hard to build a career in marketing, had successfully managed campaigns and built client relationships and contributed to company growth. But in Brittany's narrative, I was just someone filling a regular job because I wasn't capable of anything more ambitious. Marketing coordination involves quite a bit of strategy and creativity, I said, trying to keep the defensiveness out of my voice. I'm sure it does, and I bet you're really good at following directions and implementing other people's ideas. That's such a valuable skill. Her tone was the same one you might use to praise a child for coloring inside the lines. Not everyone can be a leader or a visionary. The world needs followers too. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a chance encounter. Brittany hadn't stumbled across me at Bloom Café and decided to strike up a friendly conversation. This was deliberate, calculated, designed to put me in my place and ensure I understood exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of their new life. Jake and I were actually just talking about you last week, she continued, apparently oblivious to the damage she was inflicting. We saw your car in the grocery store parking lot and he mentioned how practical you always were about transportation. He said you'd probably drive that little sedan until it completely falls apart because you're so careful with money. My car was a perfectly reliable 4-year-old Honda that I'd purchased certified pre-owned because it was fuel-efficient and dependable. But in Brittany's telling, it became evidence of my inability to afford anything better. Proof that I was someone who had to make do with less. Reliability is important to me, I said. Absolutely. And honestly, I think it's great that you've found ways to be happy without all the material things that some people think they need. She gestured around the cafe, which, despite its upscale atmosphere, was clearly a step down from whatever establishments she frequented. Like, you probably don't even miss being able to eat at really nice restaurants, or take expensive vacations, or live in a beautiful home. You've learned to find joy in smaller pleasures. The assumption that I didn't miss those things, that I had somehow trained myself to want less because I couldn't have more, was the cruelest cut of all. It suggested that my contentment was born out of resignation rather than choice, that I had lowered my standards to match my circumstances rather than building a life that reflected my values. I enjoy different things now, I said, my voice tight, with the effort of maintaining civility. That's so healthy. It's like you've learned to manage your expectations. She leaned back in her chair, clearly pleased with how the conversation was going. Jake always said you were good at adjusting to reality instead of chasing impossible dreams. Adjusting to reality. Managing expectations. Every phrase was designed to make me sound like someone who had given up, rather than someone who had made conscious choices about how to rebuild her life. Speaking of dreams, Brittany continued, her eyes lighting up with a new enthusiasm. Jake and I are looking at this absolutely incredible house in Willowbrook Estates. It's my dream home, honestly. 6 bedrooms, gourmet kitchen, infinity pool, 3-car garage. The asking price is $2.8 million, but Jake says he can probably get it for $2.6 because he knows the seller. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos, her voice taking on the breathless quality she used in her Instagram videos when she was particularly excited about something. Look at this kitchen. She turned her phone toward me, showing a sprawling space with marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, and enough cabinet space to store a restaurant's worth of supplies. And this is the master suite. Can you even imagine waking up in a room like this every morning? The photos were gorgeous, showcasing the kind of home that appeared in architectural magazines and real estate fantasies. It was everything Jake and I had once dreamed about during late-night conversations about our future, except amplified to a level of luxury we'd never dared to imagine. "It's beautiful," I said honestly, though each image felt like a physical blow. "I know, right? The listing agent says it's the most desirable property in the area. The previous owners were some tech mogul and his wife, but they're relocating to Silicon Valley. Jake thinks we can close by Christmas, which would be perfect, because I want to throw a New Year's Eve party that people will still be talking about in 5 years." She scrolled through more photos, showing me room after room of polished perfection. The home office with built-in shelving and views of the mountains. The dining room with a chandelier that probably cost more than my annual salary. The wine cellar, the home theater, the guest wing that was larger than my entire townhouse. "The best part is the location," she continued. "It's on Maple Ridge Drive, which is like the most prestigious street in Willowbrook Estates. All the neighbors are doctors and lawyers and business owners. The kind of people who really understand how to live well." The implication was clear. People like her and Jake. People who deserved beautiful things and had the means to acquire them. People unlike me, who lived in modest townhouses and drove practical cars and worked regular jobs in support roles. "It sounds like you've found exactly what you're looking for," I said, closing my laptop and beginning to gather my materials. I couldn't sit through much more of this without saying something I'd regret. "We really have. Jake says this house represents everything we've worked for, everything we deserve after building our life together. He's so proud of being able to give me the lifestyle I've always dreamed of." The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Jake was proud to give Brittany everything she'd ever wanted, while he'd spent our marriage making me feel guilty for wanting anything more than what we already had. With her, he was the generous provider fulfilling dreams. With me, he'd been the practical voice urging moderation and patience. "I'm sure you'll be very happy there," I said, standing and slinging my laptop bag over my shoulder. Brittany looked up at me with surprise, as if she'd expected me to linger and absorb more details about her perfect life. "Oh, are you leaving already? I was hoping we could catch up more. It's been so nice talking to someone who knew Jake before he became so successful." Before he became successful. Another carefully placed barb, suggesting that any success Jake had achieved had come after our marriage ended, implying that I had somehow held him back from reaching his potential. "I have a deadline to meet," I said, which was true enough. "Of course. Work responsibilities. I totally understand." She smiled sympathetically. "It must be nice to have structure like that, knowing exactly what's expected of you, and when." Even my work ethic became another point of condescension, portrayed as the simple reliability of someone following orders, rather than the professional commitment of someone managing complex projects. "Well, it was good to see you, Brittany. Congratulations on the house." "Thank you. I'm sure when we have our housewarming party, you'll drive by and see all the cars in the driveway. Everyone who's anyone in Riverside Hills will be there. It's going to be magical." I was almost at the door when she delivered the final blow, her voice carrying clearly across the cafe's afternoon quiet. "Maybe if you weren't so poor, Emma, you'd understand why some people actually deserve nice things." The words hit me like ice water across the face, stopping me in my tracks and causing several nearby customers to look up from their conversations. In that moment, all of Brittany's carefully maintained pretense of kindness fell away, revealing the cruelty that had been lurking beneath her sweet smile throughout our entire conversation. I turned around slowly, feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. Brittany was still sitting at the table, her expression perfectly composed except for a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. She had wanted this moment, had been building toward it through every subtle insult and backhanded compliment. "You know what, Brittany?" I said, my voice calm despite the fire burning in my chest. "You're absolutely right. Some people do deserve nice things." I walked out of Bloom Café with my head held high, but inside I was shaking with humiliation and rage. The encounter played on repeat in my mind as I drove home, each word cutting deeper as I analyzed the systematic way Brittany had dismantled my dignity piece by piece. That night I sat in my modest living room, staring at the walls that suddenly felt smaller and shabbier than they had that morning. For the first time since the divorce, I felt the full weight of everything I had lost and everything Jake had gained by leaving me. It wasn't just about money or material possessions. It was about respect, about being seen as someone who deserved good things, about mattering enough to be considered worthy of effort and investment. Brittany's cruelty had accomplished exactly what she'd intended. It had made me feel small, insignificant, and powerless. She had taken my contentment with my rebuilt life and turned it into evidence of my limitations, my inability to aspire to anything greater. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, something else began to take shape alongside the hurt and humiliation. It was a cold, clear anger that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with justice. Brittany had made a fundamental mistake in her assessment of who I was and what I was capable of. She saw someone who had learned to accept less because she couldn't achieve more. What she didn't see was someone who had been quietly rebuilding her strength. Someone who had spent the past year learning exactly what she was made of. Someone who was about to discover that being underestimated was the most powerful weapon of all. The dream house on Maple Ridge Drive. $2.8 million, reduced to $2.6 million for the right buyer. The most prestigious address in Willowbrook Estates. The crown jewel that would represent everything Brittany had ever wanted. As I finally turned off the lights and headed to bed, one thought echoed in my mind with crystal clarity. Some people do deserve nice things. The question was, which people? 3 days passed in a haze of wounded pride and sleepless nights. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects that didn't require approval or oversight. Anything to avoid going home to my townhouse, where the silence felt heavier than before, and every modest piece of furniture seemed to whisper Brittany's words back at me. The project I'd been working on that afternoon at Bloom Café was finally coming together, but I found it difficult to feel the usual satisfaction of a job well done. Everything felt diminished somehow, tainted by the knowledge that no matter how well I performed, no matter how many campaigns I managed successfully, I would always be someone doing a regular job in a support role to people like Brittany. Friday morning brought an unexpected reprieve. My supervisor, David Chen, called me into his office with news that our biggest client had specifically requested me to lead their upcoming holiday campaign. It was the kind of recognition I'd been working toward for months, complete with a significant budget increase and the autonomy to build my own team. They were impressed with your work on the summer launch, David explained, sliding a folder across his desk. Said you understood their brand voice better than anyone they'd worked with. This could be a real career maker, Emma. I should have been thrilled. 6 months ago, this opportunity would have felt like winning the lottery. But sitting in David's office, I found myself calculating the bonus and wondering if it would be enough to afford a better car, a nicer apartment, the kind of lifestyle that might insulate me from future encounters with women like Brittany. The timeline is aggressive, David continued. They want initial concepts by Monday, but they're willing to pay premium rates for the rush job. I figured you wouldn't mind the extra income. Extra income. The phrase hit differently than it would have a week ago, carrying implications about what David assumed about my financial situation. Did everyone see me as someone who needed extra income? Someone who had to be grateful for rush jobs and premium rates because my regular salary wasn't quite enough? I'll take it, I said, accepting the folder and forcing enthusiasm into my voice. Thank you for thinking of me. Walking back to my desk, I felt the familiar weight of being perpetually grateful. Perpetually just slightly behind where I wanted to be financially and professionally. It was a hamster wheel I'd been running on since the divorce, working hard and making progress but never quite fast enough to outrun the sense that I was always catching up to everyone else. I was deep into research that afternoon when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, local area code, but I'd learned to be cautious about answering unknown calls, since they were usually sales pitches or debt collectors looking for previous tenants. Emma Martinez speaking, I answered professionally, just in case it was work-related. Ms. Martinez, this is Nicole Reed from Pinnacle Financial Advisors. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Financial advisor. My stomach dropped, assuming this was some kind of cold call about my pathetic investment portfolio or lack thereof. I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in any financial services right now. Oh, I'm not trying to sell you anything, Nicole said quickly. I'm actually calling because you've been selected as a beneficiary for a client development program we're running. Someone has made a substantial deposit into an investment account in your name. I sat up straighter, immediately suspicious. I think you have the wrong person. I didn't apply for any programs, and I don't know anyone who would make deposits on my behalf. I understand your confusion. This is rather unusual. The deposit was made anonymously through a legal trust, with specific instructions that you be contacted this week. The amount is significant enough that we're required to meet with you in person to verify your identity and explain the terms. Scam. It had to be some elaborate scam, probably targeting recently divorced women who might be vulnerable to financial schemes. How much money are we talking about? $200,000. The number hit me like physical force. I actually dropped my pen and had to grip the edge of my desk to steady myself. That's impossible. There's no way someone deposited that amount of money for me. I assure you this is legitimate, Ms. Martinez. I have all the legal documentation here in my office. The trust was established 3 months ago with very specific instructions about timing and beneficiary notification. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person if you're available to meet this afternoon. My mind raced through possibilities. Long-lost relative? Lawsuit settlement? Lottery ticket I'd forgotten about? None of it made sense. The only people in my life with that kind of money were Jake and his circle. And they certainly hadn't developed any sudden generosity toward me. What kind of terms are we talking about? I asked, still convinced this was too good to be true. The money is yours to use as you see fit, with one stipulation. It must be used for a real estate purchase within the next 90 days. If you don't purchase property within that time frame, the funds revert back to the trust. Real estate. The coincidence was too strange to ignore, coming just days after Brittany's detailed description of her dream house and systematic humiliation about my modest living situation. But who would have access to that kind of money and any reason to help me? I'll need to see documentation, I said carefully, and I'd like to bring someone with me to the meeting. Of course. I'm actually required to have a witness present for the initial disclosure. Would 4 o'clock work for you? My office is on Main Street, above the Riverside Hills photography studio. I knew the building, a restored Victorian that housed several upscale professional services. Legitimate enough that if this was a scam, it was an elaborate one, with significant overhead costs. I'll be there, I said, then immediately called my best friend Sarah to ask if she could leave work early and accompany me to what might be either a life-changing windfall or an elaborate fraud. Pinnacle Financial Advisors occupied the entire second floor of the Victorian building, with elegant offices that spoke of serious money and established clientele. Nicole Reed was younger than I'd expected from her phone voice, probably early 30s, with the kind of polished professionalism that came from working with wealthy clients who expected perfection. Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming so quickly, she said, leading Sarah and me into a conference room with windows overlooking Main Street's historic district. I know this situation is unusual, but I promise everything is completely legitimate. She spread documents across the mahogany table like she was revealing cards in an elaborate poker game. Trust, agreements, bank statements, legal authorizations, all bearing official seals and signatures that looked genuine to my untrained eye. The trust was established by something called the Carter Foundation, Nicole explained, pointing to letterhead that meant nothing to me. They specialize in what they call strategic personal investments for individuals who have experienced significant life transitions. What does that mean exactly? Sarah asked, leaning forward to examine the documents more closely. Essentially, they identify people who have the potential for major life improvements with the right financial backing. Divorced women rebuilding their lives, young entrepreneurs with promising business ideas, individuals who have been undervalued or overlooked by traditional financial institutions. The description felt uncomfortably accurate, like someone had been studying my situation from the outside. How did they find me? I never applied for anything like this. Nicole consulted her notes. The foundation conducts its own research and outreach. They look for people who demonstrate resilience, responsibility, and untapped potential. Your credit history, employment record, and community involvement apparently caught their attention. Community involvement was a stretch, unless they counted my volunteer work at the animal shelter, but I didn't argue. $200,000 was sitting on the table in front of me, documented and legitimate, waiting for me to decide whether to trust this impossible situation. There must be some kind of catch, I said. People don't just give away money like this without expecting something in return. The only requirement is the real estate purchase within 90 days, Nicole repeated. Beyond that, the foundation asks only that beneficiaries use the opportunity to build the life they deserve rather than the life they've been forced to accept. The phrasing echoed uncomfortably with my recent experiences, as if whoever had created this trust understood exactly what it felt like to be told you should be grateful for less than what you wanted. What happens if I can't find a property to purchase in 90 days? I asked. Then the money returns to the foundation, and they select another beneficiary. But given the current real estate market in Riverside Hills, 90 days should be more than sufficient for someone with your qualifications to find suitable property. Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was either an incredibly generous gift from mysterious benefactors or the most sophisticated scam either of us had ever encountered. But the documents looked authentic, the office was real, and Nicole Reed appeared in the Colorado Bar Association directory as a licensed attorney specializing in estate planning and trust administration. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, but I should mention that the foundation specifically requested I inform you about a particular property that might interest you. Nicole pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. They've done preliminary research on homes in your preferred area and wanted to draw your attention to this listing. She slid a real estate brochure across the table, and my heart stopped completely. 847 Maple Ridge Drive. Brittany's dream house. The same stunning photos I'd been shown on her phone, the same architectural details, the same impossible perfection. But according to the listing sheet, the property had been reduced to $2.2 million due to the seller's urgent relocation timeline. How did you know? I started, then stopped, staring at the photographs with growing amazement. The foundation is very thorough in their research, Nicole said diplomatically. They believe this property represents exactly the kind of opportunity their program is designed to create. I flipped through the brochure with shaking hands. Every room I'd seen on Brittany's phone was there, captured in professional real estate photography that somehow made the house look even more spectacular. The master suite with its cathedral ceilings and mountain views. The gourmet kitchen with marble countertops and professional appliances. The infinity pool reflecting the Colorado sky. This house costs $2.2 million, I said, stating the obvious. The foundation grant is only $200,000. The foundation specializes in strategic leverage, Nicole explained. $200,000 is enough for a down payment, and they've already arranged pre-approval for qualified buyers through their preferred lending partners. Your employment history and credit score make you an ideal candidate for their mortgage program. Sarah picked up the listing sheet, studying the details with the practical eye of someone who'd helped me apartment hunt after the divorce. The monthly payments on a house like this would be astronomical, Emma, even with a large down payment. Actually, Nicole said, consulting another document, the foundation's lending program offers significantly reduced interest rates for beneficiaries. With the down payment and preferred financing, the monthly cost would be approximately $4,000. $4,000. It was more than I currently paid for rent, but not impossibly so, especially with the raise that would come with my new project responsibilities. Still expensive, but within the realm of financial possibility if I was willing to stretch my budget. This is insane, I said, looking between Sarah and Nicole. Yesterday I was worried about affording a nicer car. Today you're telling me I can buy a $2.2 million house. The foundation believes that artificial limitations often prevent people from reaching their true potential, Nicole said. Sometimes all it takes is someone believing you deserve more than you've been told to settle for. There was something in her tone, a slight emphasis on certain words, that made me look at her more carefully. Nicole Reed was professional and polished, but there was something personal in her investment in this conversation, as if my answer mattered to her beyond fulfilling her professional obligations. Can I ask you something? I said slowly. Is the Carter Foundation specifically interested in helping women who've been divorced recently? Nicole's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. The foundation is interested in helping people who have been undervalued or underestimated by those who should have supported them most. Undervalued or underestimated by those who should have supported them most. The phrase was too specific, too targeted to be coincidental. Someone knew about Jake, about the divorce, about exactly how I'd been made to feel small and insignificant. "I think I need to meet with someone from the Carter Foundation directly," I said, "before I make any decisions about this money or this house." Nicole nodded as if she'd been expecting this request. "I'll arrange a meeting for tomorrow afternoon. The foundation's director is actually in town this week, which is quite fortunate since she rarely travels to Colorado." "She? Helen Carter, the foundation's founder and director. She's very eager to meet you, Ms. Martinez. She feels a personal connection to your situation." Personal connection. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, though I couldn't yet see the complete picture. Someone with significant resources had been watching my life, studying my situation, and had decided to intervene at exactly the moment when I felt most defeated and powerless. That evening, I sat in my living room with the real estate brochure spread across my coffee table, trying to process what had happened. Sarah had left after extracting promises that I wouldn't make any major decisions without sleeping on them, but I was too wired to even consider rest. $200,000. A $2.2 million house. The same house that Brittany had described as her dream home. The crown jewel that would represent everything she and Jake had worked for and deserved. I picked up my phone and, against my better judgment, navigated to Brittany's Instagram account. Her most recent post was from that morning, showing her and Jake touring what appeared to be furniture showrooms, with a caption about designing our forever home. The photos showed them pointing at expensive sofas and dining sets, clearly already planning how to fill their dream house with appropriately luxurious furnishings. The comments were predictably supportive, filled with heart emojis and congratulations from followers who lived vicariously through Brittany's carefully curated lifestyle. But reading through them, I noticed something interesting. Several commenters mentioned how perfect the house was for her, how she deserved such a beautiful home, how lucky Jake was to be able to provide this level of luxury for his wife. The narrative was clear. Jake was the successful provider, Brittany was the deserving recipient, and their ability to afford this house was proof of their worth as a couple. They had earned this through hard work and smart decisions, unlike people who settled for less because they couldn't achieve more. I closed Instagram and picked up the listing brochure again. In the photographs, 847 Maple Ridge Drive looked like something from a fairy tale, the kind of home that graced the covers of architectural magazines and real estate fantasies. But beyond its obvious beauty, it represented something more significant: the power to choose rather than accept, to claim rather than settle. For months, I'd been rebuilding my life within the constraints of what seemed possible for someone in my situation. Modest apartment, reliable car, steady job, careful budgeting. I'd convinced myself that contentment came from accepting these limitations, from finding peace within boundaries that had been largely determined by other people's expectations. But sitting there with evidence that those boundaries might be artificial, that the life I'd been told to accept might not be the life I had to settle for, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't hope exactly, because hope implied uncertainty. This was something more dangerous and empowering, the possibility that I had been playing a game with rules that didn't actually apply to me. The next morning brought an email from Nicole, with an address I didn't recognize in the historic district, and instructions to meet Helen Carter at 11 o'clock. The building was another restored Victorian, this one converted into luxury condominiums, with a discreet bronze plaque identifying it as Carter House. Helen Carter answered the door of the penthouse unit herself, and I immediately understood why Nicole had mentioned feeling a personal connection to my situation. Helen was probably in her early 40s, impeccably dressed but not flashy, with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested significant life experience and hard-won wisdom. There was something familiar about her eyes, a quality I couldn't quite identify but that made me feel instantly comfortable. "Emma," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile, "I'm so glad you agreed to meet with me. Please, come in." The penthouse was stunning but not ostentatious, decorated with an elegant restraint that spoke of serious money handled tastefully. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the mountains, and the furnishings were clearly expensive, but chosen for comfort and beauty rather than showiness. "Can I offer you coffee, tea?" Something stronger? Helen asked, leading me to a sitting area that felt more like a friend's living room than a business meeting space. Coffee would be great, I said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Helen moved with practiced grace, preparing coffee at a bar area while maintaining conversation. Nicole tells me you have questions about the foundation and our interest in your situation. I have questions about everything, I admitted. Yesterday I was a marketing coordinator living in a townhouse and driving a Honda. Today I'm being offered enough money to buy a mansion. It doesn't feel real. I understand your skepticism. In your position, I'd be asking the same questions. Helen returned with coffee in delicate china cups, settling into the chair across from me. The Carter Foundation isn't what most people would consider a traditional charitable organization. We don't make random donations or support conventional causes. What do you support? Justice, Helen said simply. Specifically, we support women who have been systematically undervalued, manipulated, or discarded by men who promise to cherish them. We believe in evening the playing field when the game has been rigged from the beginning. The description was so precisely targeted to my situation that it felt like Helen had been reading my diary. How do you find these women? We don't have to look very hard. Unfortunately, stories like yours are more common than most people realize. Successful men who cultivate their careers and social status while slowly diminishing their wives' sense of worth and possibility. Divorces that are financially devastating for women who trusted their husbands to act fairly. New wives who are used as weapons to humiliate and diminish the women who came before. Each phrase hit like recognition, describing patterns I'd lived through but never articulated so clearly. You sound like you know this from personal experience. Helen's smile was rueful but not bitter. I was married to a real estate developer in California. Brilliant man, charming, ambitious. For 8 years, I supported his career, managed his household, entertained his clients, and slowly convinced myself that my own ambitions were less important than his success. The parallels to my own marriage were striking, but Helen continued with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had processed her experiences thoroughly. When he decided to upgrade to a younger model, I discovered that he'd been systematically moving assets beyond my reach for over 2 years. The divorce left him with most of our wealth, and me with barely enough to start over. His new wife was 26, beautiful, and completely convinced that she'd won some kind of prize. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I was about to learn something significant about the woman sitting across from me. I spent 3 years rebuilding my life and my finances. I learned things about determination and resourcefulness that I never knew I possessed. And when I was finally in a position to do so, I bought the house his new wife had been telling everyone was her dream home. My coffee cup rattled against its saucer as my hands began to shake slightly. You bought their dream house? I bought it before they could close on it, Helen said with quiet satisfaction. Paid cash, above asking price, with a closing date that beat theirs by 1 day. Then I had it completely renovated according to my own preferences, and moved in 6 months later. The story was so audacious, so perfectly calculated, that I found myself laughing despite the surreal nature of our conversation. How did they react? About as you'd expect. Shock, outrage, accusations of manipulation and unfairness. My ex-husband tried to have the sale overturned, claiming I had inside knowledge of their bid. His wife posted long social media rants about how I was a bitter woman who couldn't accept that they'd moved on. But you kept the house? I kept the house. I also kept my dignity, my sense of agency, and my belief that I deserved to live exactly as well as they thought they did. Helen leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more intense. More importantly, I learned that the best revenge isn't about hurting people who've hurt you. It's about refusing to accept the limitations they've tried to impose on your life. I set down my coffee cup, my mind racing with the implications of what Helen was telling me. The Carter Foundation isn't really about helping random women, is it? The Carter Foundation helps women whose situations resonate with my own experience, Helen corrected. Women who've been told they should be grateful for less, who've been conditioned to accept smaller lives because they supposedly lack the ambition or capability for more. And Brittany Thompson? Helen's smile was sharp, but not cruel. Brittany Thompson is about to learn that taking someone else's dream house requires making sure the previous dreamer doesn't have the resources to outbid you. The revelation hit me like lightning. This wasn't a random act of generosity or even a carefully targeted charity program. This was strategic intervention designed to give me the power to turn the tables on people who had spent months systematically humiliating me. "You know about the café conversation," I said, statement rather than question. "I know about many conversations. Riverside Hills is a small community, especially among people who frequent the same restaurants and social events. Word travels quickly when someone is being particularly cruel to someone else. How long have you been planning this?" "Since about 6 weeks after your divorce was finalized," Helen said matter-of-factly. Jake Thompson's pattern was familiar enough that I suspected it was only a matter of time before his new wife began targeting you directly. I started monitoring the situation and preparing for the right moment to intervene. Monitoring the situation. The phrase should have been disturbing, but instead I felt a profound sense of relief. For months I'd felt isolated and powerless, convinced that I was alone in recognizing the unfairness of how my marriage had ended and how my ex-husband had moved on. Learning that someone had been watching, planning, preparing to help made me feel less crazy and less alone than I had since the divorce. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "I'm proposing that you stop accepting other people's definitions of what you can afford, what you deserve, and what's possible for your life," Helen said. "The money is real, the mortgage pre-approval is legitimate, and 847 Maple Ridge Drive can be yours by the end of next week if you're willing to move quickly. And Brittany? Brittany will learn that the house she's been planning to fill with expensive furniture and social media content has been sold to someone she spent considerable effort convincing everyone was too poor to afford nice things." The poetic justice was almost too perfect to believe. But looking at Helen Carter, sitting in her beautiful penthouse that she'd clearly earned through her own efforts, I began to understand that this wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. This was about reclaiming power that had been systematically taken away. "What's the catch?" I asked. "This can't be as simple as you writing me a check and me buying a house. The only catch is that you have to believe you deserve it," Helen said. "For women who've been conditioned to accept less, that's often the hardest part. You have to be willing to claim space in a world that's told you to shrink, to own something magnificent in full view of people who've convinced you that you're not worthy of magnificence." I thought about Brittany's words in the café, her systematic dismantling of my dignity and worth. I thought about Jake's casual dismissal of our shared dreams, and his immediate transformation into someone who could provide everything for his new wife that he'd never bothered to offer me. I thought about months of rebuilding my life within constraints that had been largely imposed by other people's expectations and limitations. "When do I need to decide?" I asked. "The sellers are accepting offers through Monday," Helen said. "If you're interested, we'd need to move this weekend." This weekend. 3 days to decide whether to transform my entire life, to step into a version of myself that I'd never allowed myself to imagine, to become someone who owned a dream house instead of someone who was told she couldn't afford to dream. "Can I think about it overnight?" I asked. "Of course." "But Emma." Helen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that would be visible from every room of 847 Maple Ridge Drive. "I want you to think about something while you're deciding." "What's that?" 3 months from now, Brittany Thompson will either be moving into that house believing she won something from you, or she'll be explaining to everyone why someone she called poor was able to outbid her for her dream home. Helen turned back to me with a smile that was both kind and fierce. "Either way, she'll never be able to look at you the same way again. The question is, which version of that story you want to live." I left Helen Carter's penthouse with a business card, a direct phone number, and the strangest mixture of terror and exhilaration I'd ever experienced. Walking through downtown Riverside Hills, I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The boutiques I'd avoided because they seemed too expensive. The restaurants where I'd never bothered to make reservations. The real estate office windows displaying properties I'd trained myself not to even notice. For over a year, I'd been living like a tourist in my own life, observing a world I believed was meant for other people. Helen Carter was offering me citizenship in that world. Full membership, with all the privileges and responsibilities that came with it. The question was whether I was brave enough to accept. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house on Maple Ridge Drive in perfect detail, from the marble countertops to the mountain views to the 3-car garage that could easily accommodate vehicles far more luxurious than my modest Honda. But it wasn't the physical beauty of the house that kept me awake. It was the image of Brittany's face when she discovered that the woman she'd called poor had somehow acquired her dream home. By morning, I'd convinced myself that Helen Carter's offer was too good to be true, that somewhere in the legal documentation there had to be a catch that would make this impossible. I called in sick to work and spent the morning researching everything I could find about the Carter Foundation, Pinnacle Financial Advisors, and Helen Carter herself. What I discovered was both reassuring and unsettling. The Carter Foundation was legitimate, registered as a private charitable organization in Colorado and California, with a focus on, quote, economic empowerment for women in transition. Nicole Reed was indeed a licensed attorney with an excellent reputation in estate planning and trust administration. Helen Carter appeared in business journals and society pages as a successful real estate investor and philanthropist. But the more I researched, the more I realized how carefully Helen had curated her public image. The articles about her were consistently positive, but notably vague about her background. Her charity work was well documented, but always in support of women's causes, and always with a focus on what the articles called strategic intervention rather than traditional aid. I was still reading when my phone rang with Helen's number. "Emma, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to check in and see how you're feeling about everything." "Honestly?" "Overwhelmed and confused," I said. "I've been researching the foundation, and everything checks out, but I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "That's understandable. In your position, I'd be asking the same questions. Actually, I was wondering if you'd be interested in meeting someone who might help put your mind at ease. Another woman who's been through a similar situation. Another foundation beneficiary? Someone who understood firsthand what it's like to be systematically undermined by a husband, and then humiliated by his replacement." Helen paused. "Would you be available for lunch today? There's someone I think you should meet before you make your final decision." An hour later, I found myself at Meridian, one of Riverside Hills' most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place I'd driven past countless times but never considered entering. Helen was waiting at a corner table with another woman who looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her. "Emma, I'd like you to meet Angela Morrison," Helen said as I approached. "Angela, this is Emma Martinez." Angela Morrison was probably in her late 30s, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of serious money handled with taste rather than ostentation. She stood to shake my hand, and her smile was warm but carried an undercurrent of shared understanding that I recognized from my conversation with Helen. "I'm so glad Helen arranged this meeting," Angela said as we settled at the table. "When she told me about your situation, I felt like I was hearing my own story." "Your situation?" I asked, looking between Angela and Helen. "Angela was married to Richard Morrison for 8 years," Helen explained. "Richard is a prominent attorney here in Riverside Hills, specializes in corporate law for high-net-worth clients." "Was married," Angela corrected with a slight smile. "That ended 2 years ago when Richard decided I wasn't ambitious enough for his evolving social circle." The phrase hit me like recognition. How many times had Jake made similar comments about my contentment with our life, my supposed lack of drive to pursue more prestigious social connections? "Let me guess," I said. "He found someone younger who better matched his new image of success?" "Madison Crawford, 29, Instagram model, the kind of woman who makes networking events feel like photo shoots." Angela's tone was matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Richard was very methodical about the transition. Started creating distance between us about a year before he filed for divorce. Began criticizing things about me that he'd never had problems with before. Such as my job, my friends, my interests, my family. Suddenly nothing about me was sophisticated enough for the life he was building. I taught elementary school, which became an embarrassment because it wasn't prestigious enough for someone in his social circle. I preferred small gatherings with close friends, which made me antisocial and boring. I liked reading and gardening, which made me unambitious and domestic. The systematic nature of Angela's description was chillingly familiar. Jake had followed almost the same pattern, though I'd been too close to the situation to recognize it as a deliberate strategy rather than genuine dissatisfaction. How did the divorce play out? I asked. Exactly as you'd expect. Richard had been moving assets for months before filing. He'd increased his business expenses, invested in properties that were difficult to value, and established financial structures that protected his interests while leaving me with minimal access to what we'd built together. And Madison? Angela's smile turned sharp. Madison was very public about how she'd helped Richard see what he really deserved in a partner. She made sure everyone knew that she was supportive of his ambitions in ways I'd never been, that she understood the importance of image and social positioning. Helen had been listening quietly, but now she leaned forward. Tell Emma about the house. Ah, yes, the house. Angela took a sip of her wine, her expression becoming more animated. Richard and Madison spent months planning their dream home. Custom-built in the most exclusive part of town, every detail designed to showcase their sophisticated taste and financial success. Madison documented the entire process on social media, from the groundbreaking to the interior design selections. It sounds beautiful, I said, though I sensed there was more to this story. Oh, it was. Is. Madison made sure everyone knew it was going to be the social center of Riverside Hills, the kind of home where the right people would want to gather. She posted daily updates about fixtures and finishes, threw elaborate parties during construction milestones, basically treated the whole project like performance art. They must have been happy to finally move in. Angela and Helen exchanged a look that suggested I was missing something important. They never moved in, Angela said quietly. 3 days before closing, the construction company discovered that Richard had been systematically underpaying subcontractors and suppliers throughout the build. The liens against the property exceeded its value, and the bank called the construction loan. My eyes widened. What happened? Richard's law practice came under investigation for similar financial irregularities. Turns out he'd been using client funds to finance his lifestyle upgrades, including the house and Madison's expensive tastes. The Colorado Bar Association suspended his license pending criminal charges. And Madison? Madison discovered that being engaged to a disgraced attorney facing potential prison time wasn't quite the upgrade she'd imagined. She moved back to California about 6 months ago. The story was so devastating, so complete in its reversal of fortune, that I felt almost sorry for everyone involved. That's terrible. For everyone. The house was eventually sold at auction, Helen added. Angela bought it for about 60% of its original value. I stared at Angela with new understanding. You bought their dream house? I bought the house my ex-husband built with money he stole from our marriage, using money I earned after he discarded me. Angela's voice was calm but firm. I've spent the last year turning it into something completely different from what they'd planned. It's my home now, reflecting my tastes and my values. How did that feel? Moving into their space? It felt like justice, Angela said simply. Not revenge, exactly, because I wasn't trying to hurt them. But justice in the sense that I refused to let their vision of who deserved what determine how I lived my life. Helen signaled for the server to refill our drinks. Angela's situation is more extreme than yours, obviously. But the pattern is remarkably similar. Successful men who systematically diminish their wives while building relationships with women who represent what they think they deserve. And the new wives? I asked. Are they victims too, or are they complicit? Angela considered this carefully. I think they start as one and become the other. Madison genuinely believed she was upgrading to a better life with a more successful man. But somewhere along the way, she became invested in proving that she deserved that life more than I did. Exactly what Brittany's been doing to you, Helen observed. Making sure you understand that she's earned what you couldn't achieve. But how do you know so much about my situation specifically? I asked Helen. I mean, the cafe conversation was public enough, but you seem to know details about my marriage and divorce that I've never discussed with anyone. Helen and Angela exchanged another look, and I sensed we were approaching something important. Emma, Helen said carefully, how much do you know about Jake's business practices? He develops residential properties, mostly in upscale neighborhoods. Custom homes for wealthy clients. I paused, sensing this was leading somewhere significant. Why? Angela's ex-husband wasn't the only attorney in Riverside Hills with questionable financial practices, Helen said. Jake's company has been involved in several projects where the financing arrangements were creative. What does that mean? Angela leaned forward. It means Jake has a pattern of using other people's money to fund his lifestyle while protecting himself from financial risk. Your divorce settlement, for instance. My stomach dropped. What about my divorce settlement? Helen had some research done after your divorce was finalized, Angela said gently. Jake's property valuations during the proceedings were significantly lower than the actual market values. The house you shared, the business assets, even the investment accounts he claimed were worth less than you thought. How much less? Helen pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed her carrying. Based on current market conditions and business valuations, you should have received approximately $300,000 more than you actually got. The number hit me like a physical blow. $300,000. Money that should have been mine, that would have changed everything about how I'd been forced to rebuild my life. Is that legal? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. It's legal if the other party doesn't have adequate representation to challenge the valuations, Angela said. Did Jake recommend the attorney you used? I felt sick as I remembered Jake's helpful suggestion that I use Patricia Williams, a lawyer he said specialized in amicable divorces, and would help us avoid unnecessary conflict and expense. Patricia had been professional and seemingly competent, but she'd also been remarkably willing to accept Jake's financial documentation without extensive independent verification. He said she was someone who could help us keep things friendly and fair, I said weakly. Patricia Williams has represented 3 other women in divorces from Jake's business associates, Helen said quietly. In every case, the women received significantly less than they were entitled to based on actual asset values. The room seemed to tilt around me. You're saying Jake deliberately cheated me out of hundreds of thousands of dollars? I'm saying Jake used the same systematic approach to your divorce that he's used in his business dealings, Helen corrected. Protect his interests first, minimize his losses, and ensure that anyone who might threaten his financial security is left with as little leverage as possible. And Brittany knows about this? Angela shook her head. Brittany probably believes Jake is exactly what he appears to be. A successful businessman who can provide her with the lifestyle she wants. She has no reason to question how he acquired the resources to do that. But you're questioning it. We've been investigating it, Helen said. Jake's company is involved in a development project that's showing the same financial irregularities that brought down Richard Morrison. Questionable financing, inflated projections, and a pattern of using investor money for personal expenses. Including the house on Maple Ridge Drive, I asked. Including the house on Maple Ridge Drive, Helen confirmed. Jake's been telling Brittany they can afford it based on projections from a development deal that may not actually exist. The implications were staggering. If Jake's business was built on the same fraudulent foundation that had destroyed Angela's ex-husband, then everything Brittany believed about their financial security was an illusion. The dream house, the luxury lifestyle, the social status she'd been using to humiliate me, all of it could disappear as quickly as it had appeared. When will this all come out? I asked. The investigation is ongoing, Helen said. But these things tend to unravel quickly once they start. Based on what happened with Richard Morrison, I'd guess Jake has maybe 3 to 6 months before his financial house of cards collapses. And Brittany? Brittany will discover that the successful husband she thought she'd won is actually facing potential criminal charges for fraud, Angela said. She'll also discover that the lifestyle she's been documenting on social media was funded with stolen money. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what Helen and Angela were telling me. My ex-husband wasn't just someone who'd moved on to a better life. He was someone who'd systematically cheated me and was now in the process of destroying his new wife's life through his criminal behavior. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Because you deserve to know the truth about what was done to you, Helen said. And because you deserve the chance to reclaim what was taken from you before Jake's world collapses and takes Brittany down with it. What do you mean? Angela smiled, and for the first time since we'd started this conversation, she looked genuinely happy. The house on Maple Ridge Drive isn't just Brittany's dream home. It's also the property Jake's been using as collateral for his fraudulent development deal. If you buy it now, at fair market value, you'll own the asset he's been illegally leveraging. And when his business collapses, you'll own a $2.2 million house free and clear, while Jake and Brittany will be left with nothing but legal bills and destroyed reputations, Helen said. You'll have justice for what was done to you, and you'll have it using resources that should have been yours all along. The poetic justice was almost too perfect to believe. By helping me buy the house, Helen wasn't just giving me the power to outbid Brittany. She was helping me reclaim assets that Jake had stolen from me through legal manipulation. But what about Brittany? I asked. If she doesn't know about Jake's criminal behavior, isn't she a victim too? Angela's expression hardened slightly. Brittany chose to build her happiness on someone else's destruction. She made sure you knew that she deserved what you couldn't have. She could have chosen to be kind, to be gracious, to simply enjoy her life without humiliating someone else. Instead, she chose to be cruel, Helen added. And cruelty has consequences. What happens when Jake's arrested? Brittany will learn what every other woman in her position learns, Angela said, that marrying a man for his wealth is a dangerous game when that wealth is stolen. She'll also learn that the social circle she's been so eager to impress has very little tolerance for scandal. The same people who've been congratulating her on landing such a successful husband will distance themselves the moment his name appears in the criminal court records, Helen observed. Riverside Hills society is very protective of its reputation. I thought about all the charity events and social gatherings where Jake and Brittany had been featured as the golden couple, all the magazine articles and social media posts documenting their perfect life. When the truth came out, all of that carefully constructed image would become evidence of their involvement in criminal activity, whether Brittany had known about it or not. How can you be so sure about the timeline? I asked. Helen consulted her phone. Because the investigation is further along than most people realize. Jake received a federal subpoena yesterday morning. His accountant and several business associates have been cooperating with investigators for the past 6 weeks. Yesterday morning? How do you know that? Because I've been monitoring the situation very carefully, Helen said. When you decide to help someone reclaim what was stolen from them, you need to understand all the variables involved. And if I don't buy the house? If I decide this is all too complicated and too risky? Angela leaned forward. Then in 3 months, when Jake's arrested and his assets are frozen, you'll watch Brittany lose everything while still being reminded every day that she called you too poor to understand why some people deserve nice things. But if you buy the house now, Helen added, you'll be living in luxury while she's explaining to her social media followers why her perfect life turned out to be built on fraud. The choice was becoming clearer, though no less overwhelming. I could remain in my safe, modest life and watch from the sidelines as Jake's criminal behavior destroyed both his freedom and Brittany's illusions. Or I could step into a role I'd never imagined for myself and become someone who owned the very thing that had been used to humiliate me. There's one more thing you should know, Helen said, pulling out her phone and scrolling to what appeared to be a news article. Jake isn't the only person whose situation is about to change dramatically. She handed me the phone and I found myself reading a press release dated that morning. Thompson Development Group under federal investigation for wire fraud and money laundering. The article was brief but devastating, outlining allegations that Jake had been using investor funds for personal expenses and had falsified financial documents to secure development loans. This is public? I asked, staring at the headline. As of about 2 hours ago, Helen confirmed. Which means Brittany is probably reading about it right now. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I looked down to see Jake's name on my screen. The message was short but desperate. Emma, I need to talk to you. It's important. I showed the message to Helen and Angela, both of whom smiled with grim satisfaction. "He's probably hoping you'll provide him with a character reference," Angela said. "Or maybe he wants to explain why your divorce settlement was so low, now that he needs your sympathy." "What should I do?" "Ignore him," Helen said firmly. "Jake made his choices when he systematically cheated you out of what you were owed. He doesn't get to ask for your help now that those choices are destroying his life." My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from the same number. I declined it and immediately blocked Jake's contact information. "How does it feel?" Angela asked gently. "How does what feel?" "Knowing that you're about to have everything you deserve, while the people who tried to convince you that you deserved less are losing everything they thought they'd won." I sat quietly for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. 24 hours ago, I'd been a marketing coordinator living in a modest townhouse, nursing wounds from a café encounter that had made me feel small and powerless. Now I was being offered the chance to own a mansion, while my ex-husband faced federal charges and his new wife discovered that her perfect life was built on criminal activity. "It feels surreal," I said finally, "like I'm living in someone else's story." "You're living in your own story," Helen corrected. "For the first time in years, you're living in a story where you get to choose what happens next, where you get to decide what you deserve and what you're willing to accept. And if I choose the house? If you choose the house, you'll wake up tomorrow in a life that matches your worth, instead of a life that reflects other people's limitations," Angela said. "You'll also wake up knowing that justice isn't just something that happens to other people." Helen signaled for the check. "The offer stands until 5 o'clock today. After that, the sellers will accept other bids, and this opportunity disappears." "What would you do?" I asked both women. "If you were in my exact position?" Angela's smile was immediate and certain. "I'd buy the house. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd finally learned that accepting less than I deserve is just another form of letting someone else control my life. And I'd buy it because every day I spent in that house would be a reminder that I chose to claim my power instead of letting someone else define my limits," Helen added. As we left the restaurant, I felt like I was walking through a world that had been fundamentally transformed in the space of a few hours. The streets of Riverside Hills looked the same, but my relationship to them had changed completely. This wasn't a community where I was an outsider looking in at a life I couldn't afford. This was a place where I could choose to belong, where I could claim space and refuse to be diminished. My phone buzzed with another blocked number, probably Jake, trying to reach me from a different phone. I ignored it and instead called Helen's number. "I'll take the house," I said before she could even say hello. "Are you sure?" Helen asked, though I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "I'm sure. Not because I want revenge on Jake and Brittany, but because I'm tired of living a smaller life than I deserve." "Good," Helen said. "I'll call Nicole and have her start the paperwork. You'll be a homeowner by Monday." As I hung up the phone and walked toward my car, I caught my reflection in a storefront window. The woman looking back at me was the same person who'd left work that morning, but something essential had changed. She was someone who owned a $2.2 million house, someone who'd refused to accept that other people's definitions of what she could afford determined what she was allowed to want. Someone who'd finally learned that the best response to being called poor was to get rich. The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity that felt like living inside someone else's life. Nicole Reed worked with an efficiency that suggested she'd orchestrated similar transactions before, coordinating inspections, appraisals, and legal reviews with the kind of precision usually reserved for corporate mergers. By Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing in the marble foyer of 847 Maple Ridge Drive, holding keys to a house that had existed in my imagination as an impossible dream just 3 days earlier. The inspection had been a formality. Helen's connections had ensured that every system in the house was not only functional but pristine, from the state-of-the-art security system to the infinity pool that reflected the Colorado mountains like a mirror. Walking through room after room of architectural perfection, I kept expecting to wake up and discover this was all an elaborate fantasy my mind had constructed to cope with Brittany's humiliation. But the keys were real, solid and warm in my palm. The deed was real, bearing my name in official legal script. The house was real, and more importantly, it was mine. How does it feel? Helen asked as we stood in the master bedroom, looking out at views that stretched across the entire Riverside Hills valley. Terrifying, I said honestly, like I'm about to be found out as someone who doesn't belong here. That feeling will pass, Angela assured me. She'd driven up from Denver to see the house, and had spent the afternoon helping me plan furniture arrangements with the enthusiasm of someone who understood exactly what this moment represented. When I first moved into Richard's house, I kept expecting someone to knock on the door and tell me there'd been a mistake. When did that feeling go away? The first time I hosted a dinner party and realized I was genuinely happy in my own space, Angela said. When I understood that I wasn't living in their house anymore, I was living in my house, which happened to be built on the foundation they'd intended for themselves. Nicole appeared in the doorway with a bottle of champagne and 4 glasses. I thought we should mark the occasion properly, she said. It's not every day someone reclaims their entire life in a single real estate transaction. As we toasted to new beginnings and poetic justice, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For months I'd been living with the constant low-level anxiety of someone who was always slightly behind, always catching up, always making do with less than what felt right. Now, standing in a house that represented everything I'd been told I couldn't afford, that anxiety was replaced by something I hadn't felt since before my marriage ended, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. There's something else we need to discuss, Helen said as we settled in the living room with our champagne. Jake and Brittany are going to discover what's happened very soon, and their reaction is likely to be intense. What kind of intense? I asked. The kind that involves lawyers, angry phone calls, and probably some very public accusations about manipulation and fraud, Nicole said matter-of-factly. People who lose what they consider rightfully theirs rarely go quietly. But everything we've done is completely legal? Completely legal, Helen confirmed. But Jake's facing criminal charges and Brittany's about to lose her dream house. Legal doesn't mean they won't try to make your life difficult. Angela nodded grimly. When Richard's house was sold at auction, he tried everything he could think of to contest the sale. Claimed I had insider information, accused me of collusion with the bank, even suggested I'd somehow engineered his legal troubles to get revenge. How did you handle it? I documented everything, stayed calm, and let the legal system work, Angela said. Most importantly, I refused to engage with his attempts to make me feel guilty for claiming what was rightfully mine. The key is to remember that their anger isn't really about you, Helen added. It's about losing control over a narrative they thought they controlled. For months, Jake and Brittany have been the successful couple living their dream life, while you were the discarded wife who'd been left with less. Now that story has been completely reversed. I thought about the social media posts, the charity event photos, the carefully curated image of their perfect life. All of it had been built on the assumption that they deserved more than I did, that their success was proof of their superior worth and judgment. What should I expect specifically? I asked. Nicole consulted her phone. Well, the real estate agent representing Jake and Brittany called my office this morning asking about our buyer. She seemed surprised to learn that Emma Martinez had submitted the winning bid. Surprised how? Let's just say, she was very explicit about her belief that our client couldn't possibly have the financial resources to purchase this property, Nicole said dryly. She requested verification of our pre-approval letter and suggested there might be some kind of error. And you told her? I told her that our client's financial qualifications had been thoroughly verified and that all documentation was available for review through proper legal channels. Nicole smiled. I also mentioned that any attempts to interfere with a legitimate real estate transaction could result in legal action for tortious interference. The idea of Brittany and Jake learning that I'd outbid them was both thrilling and terrifying. For so long, they'd held all the power in our dynamic, able to make me feel small and unsuccessful through their very existence. Now I was about to shatter their entire understanding of who had the power to claim what. When will they find out officially? I asked. The sellers accepted your offer this morning, Helen said. Contracts were signed an hour ago. Jake and Brittany's real estate agent should be notifying them any minute now that the property is no longer available. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I looked at the screen uncertainly. Answer it, Angela said. This is probably the first of several calls you'll receive today. I accepted the call and put it on speaker so the others could hear. Emma Martinez? The voice was female, professionally cheerful, with an underlying tension that suggested the speaker was struggling to maintain composure. This is Emma. This is Jessica Walsh from Premier Properties. I represent Jake and Brittany Thompson, and I'm calling about the Maple Ridge Drive property. What about it? Well, there seems to be some confusion. My clients have been working toward purchasing this house for several months, and they were told their offer would be accepted pending final financing approval. Now I'm hearing that the property has been sold to someone else. The barely controlled frustration in Jessica's voice was unmistakable. She'd clearly promised Jake and Brittany that the house was theirs, and now she was facing the professional embarrassment of having to explain how another buyer had swooped in. There's no confusion, I said calmly. I submitted a competitive offer, and it was accepted. But my clients have been planning this purchase for months. They've already begun making arrangements for moving, hiring contractors, planning renovations. This is their dream home. The entitlement in her tone was staggering. As if months of planning somehow created a legal right to purchase a property, as if wanting something badly enough meant other buyers should step aside. I'm sure this is disappointing for your clients, I said, meeting Angela's approving gaze. But planning to buy a house isn't the same as actually buying it. Ms. Martinez, can I be frank with you? Jessica's professional veneer was slipping. This house is significantly outside what most people in your situation could afford. Are you certain your financing is solid? Because if there are any issues with your loan approval, my clients are still interested and ready to close immediately. Your situation. The phrase was clearly code for whatever assumptions Jessica had made about my financial capacity based on information from Jake and Brittany. They'd obviously painted me as someone who couldn't possibly compete with them for anything truly valuable. My financing is rock solid, I said, looking around the living room that was now legally mine. In fact, the purchase has already been completed. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Completed? Jessica finally said. That's not possible. The sellers told us they needed more time to review offers. Perhaps you should contact the sellers directly for clarification, I suggested. I'm sure they can explain their decision-making process. This is highly irregular, Jessica said, her voice rising. My clients are going to want answers about how this happened so quickly. They're going to want to know who you are and how you were able to finance this purchase. Your clients are welcome to ask their questions through proper legal channels, Nicole interjected, speaking toward my phone. This is Nicole Reed, representing Ms. Martinez. Any further communication about this transaction should go through my office. Jessica seemed to realize she'd overstepped professional boundaries. I'll be in touch, she said curtly before ending the call. Well, Helen said, raising her champagne glass again. That was faster than I expected. She sounded genuinely shocked, I observed. Like the idea of me buying this house was so impossible she couldn't process it. Because Jake and Brittany have spent months telling everyone that you're someone who can't afford nice things, Angela said. They've built their entire social narrative around the idea that they deserve luxury while you deserve less. And now that narrative has been completely destroyed, Helen added. Not only can you afford the house they wanted, but you got it while they lost it. My phone buzzed with a text message, this one from Brittany's number. We need to talk. This is ridiculous and unfair. I showed the message to the others, all of whom smiled with varying degrees of satisfaction. Ridiculous and unfair, Angela repeated. Interesting word choices from someone who spent months publicly documenting how much more she deserved than other people. Should I respond? I asked. Not yet, Helen advised. Let them process what's happened first. Right now they're probably in shock and denial. Give them time to move through anger and bargaining before you engage. Within the hour, my phone was buzzing almost constantly. 3 more calls from numbers I didn't recognize, 2 voicemails from Jessica Walsh demanding callbacks, and a series of increasingly frantic text messages from both Jake and Brittany. From Jake, Emma, I don't know what game you're playing, but this needs to stop. Call me. From Brittany, how is this possible? That house costs more than you make in 5 years. From Jake, I know you're angry about the divorce, but this is insane. You can't afford that house. From Brittany, this is obviously some kind of revenge plot. Everyone is going to see right through it. From Jake, Emma, I'm serious. Call me back or I'm coming to your apartment. The last message made Helen's expression darken. He doesn't get to threaten you with unwanted contact because he's unhappy about losing something he never actually owned. Is it a threat, though? I asked. Maybe he just wants to talk. Men like Jake don't just want to talk when they're losing control, Angela said firmly. They want to intimidate and manipulate until they regain the upper hand. Trust me on this. Nicole was already pulling out her phone. I'm going to have a cease and desist letter delivered to both Jake and Brittany within the hour. Any further attempts to contact you directly will be considered harassment. Is that necessary? It's protective, Helen said. You need to establish boundaries now, before they escalate their attempts to pressure you into giving up the house. As if to prove her point, my phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized. Patricia Williams, the attorney who'd represented me during the divorce. Emma, hello. I hope you're well. I'm calling because I've received some concerning information about a real estate transaction you've apparently been involved in. Concerning how? Well, Jake Thompson contacted my office this afternoon claiming that you've somehow acquired financing to purchase a property that's substantially beyond your financial means. He's worried that you might be involved in some kind of fraud or that someone might be taking advantage of your financial situation. The audacity was breathtaking. Jake was trying to use my former attorney to pressure me into revealing details about my finances, presenting his concern as protection rather than manipulation. My real estate transaction is none of Jake's business, I said firmly. And frankly, Patricia, I'm surprised you'd contact me about this without understanding the ethical implications. I'm just trying to help, Patricia said, though her tone suggested she was beginning to realize she'd made a mistake. Jake seemed genuinely concerned that you might be in over your head financially. Jake Thompson is facing federal fraud charges, I said, watching Nicole nod approvingly. His concern about other people's financial decisions seems rather misplaced. The silence that followed suggested Patricia was learning about Jake's legal troubles for the first time. I wasn't aware of any federal charges, she said carefully. Perhaps you should research your sources more thoroughly before accepting their characterizations of other people's situations, I suggested. I'll be ending this conversation now, and I'd prefer not to receive any similar calls in the future. I hung up and immediately blocked Patricia's number as well. How many people do you think Jake and Brittany are calling? I asked. Probably everyone they can think of, Angela said. When Richard's legal troubles started, he spent weeks calling mutual friends and business associates, trying to control the narrative and find someone who could help him fix his problems. The difference is that Jake's problems can't be fixed, Helen observed. Federal fraud charges don't disappear because you're embarrassed about them. His best option now is to plea bargain and hope for minimal prison time. And Brittany? Brittany is about to discover that the life she thought she'd won was built on criminal activity, Nicole said. Her Instagram perfect lifestyle is going to become evidence in a federal case. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from a number I didn't recognize. This is Brittany. Jake doesn't have his phone, but we need to talk. You're making a huge mistake and you're going to regret this. I showed the message to the others. Now she's making threats, Helen said. Time to implement some serious boundaries. Within 2 hours, Nicole had served both Jake and Brittany with cease and desist letters, formally notifying them that any further attempts to contact me would result in legal action for harassment. She'd also filed restraining order paperwork as a precautionary measure, creating a legal record of their increasingly aggressive behavior. What happens now? I asked as we prepared to leave the house for the evening. Now you move in and start living your life, Helen said simply. You've already won, Emma. Everything else is just them processing their loss. But what if they try to contest the sale? What if they find some legal way to challenge the purchase? They can't, Nicole assured me. The transaction was completely legitimate, properly financed, and legally executed. They have no grounds for any kind of challenge. More importantly, Angela added, you need to stop thinking like someone who has to justify claiming what's rightfully yours. You bought this house with legitimate money through a legitimate process. You don't owe anyone explanations or apologies. As we locked up the house and prepared to go our separate ways, I felt the surreal nature of the day settling around me like a new skin. 12 hours ago, I'd been someone who rented a modest townhouse and drove a practical car. Now I was someone who owned a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in Riverside Hills. But more than the house itself, what had changed was my relationship to possibility. For over a year, I'd been living within limits that had been largely defined by other people's expectations and my own internalized sense of what someone in my situation could reasonably expect to achieve. Helen, Angela, and Nicole had shown me that those limits were artificial, that the life I'd been told to accept was just one option among many. They'd given me not just the financial means to claim something better, but the emotional support to believe I deserved it. Thank you, I said as we stood in the circular driveway, looking back at the house that was somehow, impossibly mine. Thank yourself, Helen said. You're the one who had the courage to say yes when opportunity presented itself. And you're the one who'll have the strength to live with the consequences, Angela added. Because Jake and Brittany aren't going to give up easily. As if summoned by her words, a familiar car turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. Jake's BMW, driving slowly past the house with both occupants staring at us through the windshield. Well, Nicole said dryly, this should be interesting. The car stopped in front of the house, and after a moment of visible discussion between the occupants, both doors opened. Jake emerged first, looking older and more haggard than I'd seen him since our college days. Brittany followed, her usual polished perfection, slightly frayed around the edges. They approached our group with the kind of forced confidence that suggested they'd rehearsed this confrontation, but weren't entirely sure how to execute it. Emma, Jake said, his voice carefully controlled. We need to talk. No, you don't, Nicole interjected smoothly. Mr. Thompson, you were served with a cease and desist letter this afternoon. This conversation constitutes a violation of that legal notice. Jake ignored her and looked directly at me. Emma, I don't know what these people have told you or how they've convinced you to get involved in this, but you're being used. You can't afford this house, and when their scheme falls apart, you're going to lose everything. The paternalistic tone was exactly the same one he'd used throughout our marriage, whenever I'd expressed interest in anything he considered beyond my capabilities. He was speaking to me like I was a child who'd been manipulated by adults with ulterior motives. I can afford this house, Jake, I said calmly. I can afford it because I have the financial resources and creditworthiness to secure a mortgage for it. With what money? Brittany demanded, apparently unable to contain herself any longer. 2 days ago, you were living in a rental townhouse and driving a car that's older than our relationship. Now suddenly you can afford a $2.2 million house? That doesn't happen unless someone's committing fraud. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Brittany was essentially calling me a criminal, suggesting that the only possible explanation for my good fortune was illegal activity. Are you suggesting that I've committed fraud, Mrs. Thompson? I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I'm suggesting that something here doesn't add up, Brittany said, her social media polish completely abandoned in favor of raw anger. People don't just magically acquire wealth overnight unless they're doing something illegal or someone's pulling strings behind the scenes. You mean like how people don't just magically acquire wealth by marrying men who steal from their business partners and investors? Angela asked sweetly. The comment hit Brittany like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, her face flushing with a combination of anger and what looked like genuine confusion. What is that supposed to mean? She demanded. It means your husband is facing federal charges for wire fraud and money laundering, Helen said matter-of-factly. It means the lifestyle you've been documenting on social media was funded with stolen money. And it means that Emma has more right to this house than either of you do, considering it was purchased with money that was stolen from her divorce settlement. Jake's carefully controlled facade cracked completely. That's bullshit, he said, his voice rising. My business dealings are completely legitimate, and my divorce from Emma was fair and legal. Fair and legal according to whom? Nicole asked. The attorney you recommended who consistently undervalued your assets. The appraiser who happened to be your business partner's friend. The financial advisor who helped you move money into accounts Emma couldn't access. The systematic nature of Jake's deception was laid out like evidence in a trial, each question highlighting another aspect of his manipulation. I watched his expression change as he realized how thoroughly his financial maneuvers had been investigated and documented. "You can't prove any of that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, we can," Helen said calmly. "And we will, when the federal investigators request documentation about your financial history during your marriage to Emma." Brittany had been looking back and forth between the speakers like she was watching a tennis match, her expression growing more panicked with each revelation. "Jake," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "What are they talking about? What federal investigators?" For the first time since they'd arrived, Jake looked directly at his wife. I saw the moment when he realized he could no longer maintain the fiction that everything was under control, that this was just a temporary setback they could overcome together. "It's complicated," he said weakly. "How complicated?" Brittany pressed. "Jake, are you in legal trouble? Real legal trouble?" The vulnerability in her voice was almost heartbreaking. For all her cruelty toward me, in this moment Brittany sounded like a woman who was beginning to understand that the life she'd built was about to collapse around her. "We should discuss this privately," Jake said, reaching for her arm. Brittany pulled away from him, her media-trained instincts apparently kicking in as she processed the implications of what she'd just heard. "Did you steal money?" she asked bluntly. "From your business? From investors? From Emma?" "It's not that simple," Jake said, but his inability to deny the accusations was answer enough. Brittany stared at him for a long moment, and I could see her mentally reviewing everything she knew about their finances, their lifestyle, their plans for the future. The house they'd wanted to buy, the renovations they'd planned, the social events they'd hosted. All of it suddenly suspect. "Oh my God," she whispered. "The house. Our house. You told me we could afford it because of your new development deal." "We can still afford it," Jake said desperately. "This is all going to be straightened out. These accusations are just attempts to damage my reputation." "What development deal, Jake?" Brittany's voice was getting stronger, more demanding. "The one that apparently doesn't exist. The one you've been using to steal money from people." "I never stole money from anyone," Jake said, but even he seemed to realize how hollow the denial sounded. "You stole money from me," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "You systematically undervalued our marital assets and used legal manipulation to ensure I received hundreds of thousands of dollars less than I was entitled to." Jake turned to me with an expression that mixed desperation with the kind of manipulative charm he'd always used when he needed to convince someone of something. "Emma, you know that's not true. Our divorce was amicable. We both agreed to the settlement terms." "I agreed to settlement terms based on financial information you deliberately falsified," I corrected. "I agreed because I trusted you to be honest about what we owned and what it was worth." "You got a fair settlement for someone in your position," Jake said, falling back on the same language he'd used throughout our divorce proceedings. "What position was that, Jake?" I asked. "The position of being married to someone who was planning to cheat me out of what I'd helped build so he could start over with more assets than he'd disclosed." Brittany was staring at Jake with an expression I recognized from my own marriage, the look of someone who was beginning to see clearly for the first time in years. "How much money are we talking about?" she asked. "How much did you steal from Emma?" "I didn't steal anything," Jake insisted, but his voice was losing strength with each denial. $300,000, Helen said calmly. "Based on current market valuations, Emma should have received approximately $300,000 more than she actually got." The number seemed to hit Brittany like a physical blow. $300,000 was real money, life-changing money, enough to make the difference between struggling and thriving. "That's why she can afford this house," Brittany said slowly, understanding dawning across her features. "Because she's getting back what you stole from her." "Nobody stole anything," Jake said, but he was beginning to sound like a recording stuck on repeat. "Jake," Brittany said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from her before. Authoritative? demanding, done with being charmed and manipulated. I need you to tell me the truth right now. Did you steal money from Emma during your divorce? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Jake looked around at all of us, perhaps hoping for some escape from the corner he'd painted himself into, but finding only faces that were waiting for his answer. It's complicated, he said finally. No, Brittany said firmly. It's not complicated. Either you stole money from your ex-wife or you didn't. Either our life together is built on criminal activity or it isn't. Either everything you've told me about our finances is true or it's all been lies. Jake's shoulders sagged as he seemed to realize that his carefully constructed world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I did what I had to do to protect my assets, he said quietly. I couldn't let her take half of everything I'd worked for. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Jake had finally acknowledged what we all already knew, that he'd systematically cheated me out of money that was rightfully mine, that his new life with Brittany had been built on assets stolen from his previous life with me. Brittany stared at him for a long moment, then turned to look at the house that was now mine instead of hers. This should have been Emma's house all along, she said quietly. If you hadn't stolen her money, she would have been able to afford a house like this after the divorce. That's not how it works, Jake protested weakly. That's exactly how it works, Brittany said, her voice growing stronger. You stole her money, then you brought me into your life and let me treat her like she was worth less than us. You let me humiliate her because she couldn't afford the things we could afford with her own money. The recognition in Brittany's voice was devastating to witness. She was realizing not just that Jake had lied to her about his finances, but that she'd been used as a weapon to hurt someone who had already been victimized. Emma, she said, turning to face me directly. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I said to you, and I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't know. The apology was so unexpected, so genuine, that for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the polished, artificial Brittany from social media or the cruel woman from the café. This was someone who had just discovered that her entire life was a lie and was trying to process the magnitude of her situation. Thank you, I said simply. What happens now? Brittany asked, looking around at all of us. To Jake, to me, to everything we thought we had? Now Jake faces the consequences of his criminal behavior, Nicole said. And you decide how much of your life you want to spend dealing with those consequences. Brittany nodded slowly, then looked at Jake with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time since they'd met. I think I need to find my own attorney, she said, someone who represents my interests instead of yours. Brittany, wait, Jake said desperately. We can work through this together. I made some mistakes, but we can fix this. No, Brittany said firmly. You made choices, criminal choices. And now I have to make choices about how much of my life I want to spend paying for yours. She turned and walked back toward the car, leaving Jake standing in my driveway looking lost and defeated. This isn't over, Emma, he said, his voice carrying a note of threat that made Helen step closer to me. Yes, it is, I said calmly. It's been over since the moment you decided I was worth less than what you could take from me. Jake stared at me for another moment, then followed Brittany to the car. They drove away in silence, leaving the four of us standing in front of the house that had become the symbol of everything. Their relationship had cost, and everything mine had gained. How do you feel? Angela asked as we watched their taillights disappear around the corner. I looked up at the house that was mine, at the mountains visible in the distance, at the life I'd somehow managed to claim for myself despite everyone who'd tried to convince me I didn't deserve it. Like I'm finally living in the right story, I said. 3 weeks later, I woke up in the master bedroom of 847 Maple Ridge Drive to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Colorado mountains that still took my breath away every single morning. The house had been professionally furnished with pieces I'd selected myself, each room reflecting my tastes, rather than someone else's vision of what I should want. The kitchen where I made my morning coffee featured the marble countertops and professional appliances that Brittany had once described to me in detail, except now they were mine to use as I pleased. The adjustment to living in luxury had been surprisingly natural. I'd worried that I'd feel like an imposter in such an elegant space, but instead I felt like I was finally living in surroundings that matched who I'd always been inside. The house wasn't just beautiful, it was comfortable, functional, and perfectly suited to the life I was building for myself. My morning routine now included checking the security system, which had proven necessary given the events of the past few weeks. Jake and Brittany's initial confrontation in my driveway had been followed by several more attempts at contact, each more desperate than the last. The restraining order Nicole had filed had been granted permanently after Jake was caught driving past the house multiple times and attempting to approach me at my workplace. The legal proceedings against Jake had moved faster than anyone had expected. Federal investigators had been building their case for months before Helen's intervention in my situation, and my testimony about the divorce settlement had provided additional evidence of his pattern of financial manipulation. 3 days ago, Jake had been formally indicted on 14 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His bail had been set at $500,000, an amount that he'd been unable to post now that his assets were frozen. Brittany's world had collapsed even more dramatically than Jake's. Within 48 hours of their confrontation at my house, she'd hired her own attorney and filed for divorce. Her social media accounts, which had once showcased their perfect life together, had gone completely silent. The influencer who had built her brand around luxury lifestyle content suddenly had no lifestyle to document and no luxury to display. The speed of her fall from grace had been breathtaking to watch, though I found myself feeling more sympathy for her than I'd expected. Unlike Jake, who had orchestrated the entire fraudulent scheme, Brittany had been genuinely unaware that her perfect life was built on criminal activity. She'd been cruel to me, certainly, but she'd also been manipulated by someone she trusted. My phone rang as I was finishing my coffee, Helen's name appearing on the screen. "Good morning," I answered. "How did the meeting go yesterday?" Helen had been working with federal investigators to provide background information about Jake's financial activities during our marriage. Her foundation's resources had proven invaluable in documenting the systematic way Jake had hidden assets and manipulated valuations. "Better than expected," Helen said. "The investigators are recommending that Jake's plea agreement include full restitution to all his victims, including you. They're also pursuing civil asset forfeiture for any property he acquired using fraudulent funds." What does that mean practically? It means you're likely to recover not just the $300,000 he stole from your divorce settlement, but additional compensation for the impact his fraud had on your life. Helen paused. "It also means Jake will probably spend the next 5 to 7 years in federal prison." The finality of it was staggering. 3 months ago, Jake had been a successful businessman planning to buy his dream house with his beautiful wife. Now he was facing significant prison time and financial ruin, while I was living in the house they'd wanted and rebuilding my life with resources that should have been mine all along. "How's Brittany handling everything?" I asked. "Not well," Helen admitted. "Her attorney contacted Nicole yesterday asking if you'd be willing to meet with her. Apparently she wants to apologize in person and ask for your forgiveness." The request surprised me. Since our confrontation in the driveway, Brittany had maintained complete silence. Her social media accounts remained inactive, and according to local gossip, she'd moved out of the house she'd shared with Jake and was staying with friends in Denver. "Do you think I should meet with her?" "That's entirely up to you," Helen said. "But I think it might be healing for both of you. She's facing the consequences of choices she didn't know she was making, and you're in a position to show grace if you choose to." After ending the call with Helen, I spent the morning working in my home office, a sunny room with built-in shelving that overlooked the garden. The new position I'd accepted as marketing director for a boutique consulting firm allowed me to work remotely several days a week, and I discovered that having a beautiful, peaceful workspace significantly improved both my productivity and my job satisfaction. The consulting firm had approached me after word spread about the creative campaigns I'd been developing at my previous job. What had started as a necessity to prove my worth had evolved into recognition of genuine talent and strategic thinking. My new salary was nearly double what I'd been making, and the signing bonus had been enough to furnish the house exactly as I wanted it. Around noon, I received a text message from an unknown number. "This is Brittany. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I was hoping we could talk in person. I understand if you say no, but I would really appreciate the chance to apologize properly." I stared at the message for several minutes, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let Brittany deal with the consequences of her actions without my involvement. But another part of me was curious about what she wanted to say, and whether a conversation might provide closure for both of us. I called Helen to discuss the request. "If you decide to meet with her, I'd suggest doing it in a public place with someone else present," Helen advised. "Not because I think she's dangerous, but because you want witnesses to whatever she says." "Would you come with me?" "Of course. And I think Angela would want to be there too. She's been following your situation closely and has some insights about dealing with the wives of men like Jake." We arranged to meet Brittany that afternoon at a quiet restaurant in downtown Riverside Hills. I chose the location carefully, somewhere public enough to feel safe, but private enough for a sensitive conversation. Brittany arrived early and was already seated when we got there. The transformation in her appearance was striking. Gone was the polished perfection I'd always associated with her. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, minimal makeup, and her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail. She looked younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "Emma," she said as I approached the table, standing uncertainly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I wasn't sure you would." "Helen and Angela," I said, introducing my companions. "They've been helping me navigate everything that's happened." Brittany nodded to both women with obvious nervousness. "I know who you are," she said to Angela. "I researched what happened with your ex-husband after I learned about Jake's legal troubles." We settled at the table, and for a moment nobody spoke. Brittany seemed to be gathering her courage, while Helen, Angela, and I waited to hear what she had to say. "I don't know where to start," Brittany finally said. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you for weeks, and now that we're here, it all seems inadequate." "Why don't you start with why you wanted to meet?" I suggested. "Because I owe you an apology that's bigger than anything I can put into words," Brittany said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because I was unbelievably cruel to you, and because I need you to know that I had no idea what Jake had done during your divorce." "I believe you," I said, and I realized I meant it. "Jake is very good at manipulating people and controlling information. That's not an excuse for how I treated you," Brittany said firmly. "Even if I didn't know about the stolen money, I knew I was being mean to someone who had never done anything to me. I chose to be cruel because it made me feel superior." The honesty was unexpected and powerful. Brittany wasn't making excuses or trying to minimize her behavior. She was taking full responsibility for her choices. "Why?" I asked. "What did you get out of making me feel small?" Brittany was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the question. "Because I was insecure," she said finally. "Because deep down I knew that Jake had been married to you for 8 years, and I was terrified that he still cared about you more than he cared about me. So you decided to prove that you were better than me?" "I decided to prove to myself that you weren't a threat," Brittany corrected. "If I could convince myself that you were poor and pathetic and undeserving, then I didn't have to worry about Jake comparing us and finding me lacking." The psychology made sense, though it didn't excuse the behavior. Brittany had dealt with her insecurity by trying to diminish me rather than addressing her own fears about Jake's feelings. "Did it work?" Angela asked. "Did making Emma feel bad make you feel more secure?" "No," Brittany said immediately. "It made me feel powerful in the moment, but it never actually made me feel more confident about my relationship with Jake. If anything, it made me more paranoid, because I knew I was capable of being that cruel to someone who didn't deserve it." "And now?" I asked. "Now I know that my insecurity was justified, but not for the reasons I thought," Brittany said with a bitter laugh. "I wasn't competing with you for Jake's affection. I was competing with you for access to money that was rightfully yours." The insight was devastating in its accuracy. Brittany's entire relationship with Jake had been built on resources he'd stolen from me. The lifestyle she'd been so proud of, the house she'd wanted to buy, the social status she'd enjoyed. All of it had been financed with money that should have been mine. "What happens to you now?" Helen asked gently. "I'm starting over," Brittany said. "I've moved back to Denver. I'm staying with friends while I look for an apartment. And I'm trying to figure out how to rebuild my life without the financial support I thought I had." "What about your social media career?" "Gone," Brittany said matter-of-factly. Turns out that lifestyle influencing doesn't work when you don't have a lifestyle to influence about. Plus, being associated with a federal fraud case isn't great for brand partnerships. The practical consequences of Jake's crimes were rippling through every aspect of Brittany's life. She'd built her entire career around documenting luxury experiences she could no longer afford, and her personal brand was now permanently associated with criminal activity. "I'm actually thinking about going back to school," she continued. "I have a bachelor's degree in marketing that I never really used because the influencer thing took off. Maybe it's time to build a career that doesn't depend on someone else's money." "That sounds like a good plan," I said, and I meant it. The woman sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the one who had humiliated me in the café. This Brittany seemed genuine, thoughtful, and genuinely remorseful. "Emma," she said, leaning forward slightly, "I need you to know that I understand what I did to you was unforgivable. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking for your friendship or your sympathy. I just needed you to hear me take responsibility for my actions. Marble countertops and professional appliances. The infinity pool reflecting the Colorado sky. This house costs $2.2 million, I said, stating the obvious. The foundation grant is only $200,000. The foundation specializes in strategic leverage, Nicole explained. $200,000 is enough for a down payment. And they've already arranged pre-approval for qualified buyers through their preferred lending partners. Your employment history and credit score make you an ideal candidate for their mortgage program." Sarah picked up the listing sheet, studying the details with the practical eye of someone who'd helped me apartment hunt after the divorce. "The monthly payments on a house like this would be astronomical, Emma, even with a large down payment." "Actually," Nicole said, consulting another document, "the foundation's lending program offers significantly reduced interest rates for beneficiaries. With the down payment and preferred financing, the monthly cost would be approximately $4,000. $4,000. It was more than I currently paid for rent, but not impossibly so, especially with the raise that would come with my new project responsibilities. Still expensive, but within the realm of financial possibility if I was willing to stretch my budget." "This is insane," I said, looking between Sarah and Nicole. "Yesterday I was worried about affording a nicer car. Today you're telling me I can buy a $2.2 million house. The foundation believes that artificial limitations often prevent people from reaching their true potential," Nicole said. "Sometimes all it takes is someone believing you deserve more than you've been told to settle for." There was something in her tone, a slight emphasis on certain words, that made me look at her more carefully. Nicole Reed was professional and polished, but there was something personal in her investment in this conversation, as if my answer mattered to her beyond fulfilling her professional obligations. "Can I ask you something?" I said slowly. "Is the Carter Foundation specifically interested in helping women who've been divorced recently?" Nicole's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "The foundation is interested in helping people who have been undervalued or underestimated by those who should have supported them most." Undervalued or underestimated by those who should have supported them most. The phrase was too specific, too targeted to be coincidental. Someone knew about Jake, about the divorce, about exactly how I'd been made to feel small and insignificant. "I think I need to meet with someone from the Carter Foundation directly," I said, "before I make any decisions about this money or this house." Nicole nodded as if she'd been expecting this request. "I'll arrange a meeting for tomorrow afternoon. The foundation's director is actually in town this week, which is quite fortunate since she rarely travels to Colorado." "She?" "Helen Carter, the foundation's founder and director. She's very eager to meet you, Ms. Martinez. She feels a personal connection to your situation." Personal connection. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, though I couldn't yet see the complete picture. Someone with significant resources had been watching my life, studying my situation, and had decided to intervene at exactly the moment when I felt most defeated and powerless. That evening, I sat in my living room with the real estate brochure spread across my coffee table, trying to process what had happened. Sarah had left after extracting promises that I wouldn't make any major decisions without sleeping on them, but I was too wired to even consider rest. $200,000. A $2.2 million house. The same house that Brittany had described as her dream home. The crown jewel that would represent everything she and Jake had worked for and deserved. I picked up my phone and, against my better judgment, navigated to Brittany's Instagram account. Her most recent post was from that morning, showing her and Jake touring what appeared to be furniture showrooms, with a caption about designing our forever home. The photos showed them pointing at expensive sofas and dining sets, clearly already planning how to fill their dream house with appropriately luxurious furnishings. The comments were predictably supportive, filled with heart emojis and congratulations from followers who lived vicariously through Brittany's carefully curated lifestyle. But reading through them, I noticed something interesting. Several commenters mentioned how perfect the house was for her, how she deserved such a beautiful home, how lucky Jake was to be able to provide this level of luxury for his wife. The narrative was clear. Jake was the successful provider, Brittany was the deserving recipient, and their ability to afford this house was proof of their worth as a couple. They had earned this through hard work and smart decisions, unlike people who settled for less because they couldn't achieve more. I closed Instagram and picked up the listing brochure again. In the photographs, 847 Maple Ridge Drive looked like something from a fairy tale, the kind of home that graced the covers of architectural magazines and real estate fantasies. But beyond its obvious beauty, it represented something more significant. The power to choose rather than accept, to claim rather than settle. For months, I'd been rebuilding my life within the constraints of what seemed possible for someone in my situation. Modest apartment, reliable car, steady job, careful budgeting. I'd convinced myself that contentment came from accepting these limitations, from finding peace within boundaries that had been largely determined by other people's expectations. But sitting there with evidence that those boundaries might be artificial, that the life I'd been told to accept might not be the life I had to settle for, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't hope exactly, because hope implied uncertainty. This was something more dangerous and empowering, the possibility that I had been playing a game with rules that didn't actually apply to me. The next morning brought an email from Nicole, with an address I didn't recognize in the historic district and instructions to meet Helen Carter at 11 o'clock. The building was another restored Victorian, this one converted into luxury condominiums, with a discreet bronze plaque identifying it as Carter House. Helen Carter answered the door of the penthouse unit herself, and I immediately understood why Nicole had mentioned feeling a personal connection to my situation. Helen was probably in her early 40s, impeccably dressed but not flashy, with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested significant life experience and hard-won wisdom. There was something familiar about her eyes, a quality I couldn't quite identify but that made me feel instantly comfortable. "Emma," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile, "I'm so glad you agreed to meet with me. Please, come in." The penthouse was stunning but not ostentatious, decorated with an elegant restraint that spoke of serious money handled tastefully. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the mountains, and the furnishings were clearly expensive, but chosen for comfort and beauty rather than showiness. "Can I offer you coffee, tea, something stronger?" Helen asked, leading me to a sitting area that felt more like a friend's living room than a business meeting space. "Coffee would be great," I said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Helen moved with practiced grace, preparing coffee at a bar area while maintaining conversation. "Nicole tells me you have questions about the foundation and our interest in your situation." "I have questions about everything," I admitted. "Yesterday I was a marketing coordinator living in a townhouse and driving a Honda. Today I'm being offered enough money to buy a mansion. It doesn't feel real." "I understand your skepticism. In your position, I'd be asking the same questions." Helen returned with coffee in delicate china cups, settling into the chair across from me. "The Carter Foundation isn't what most people would consider a traditional charitable organization. We, probably feeling exactly as powerless and defeated as I had felt a year ago. Someone who'd been told she should be grateful for less, who'd been convinced that the life she'd been forced to accept was the life she deserved. I typed my response. "I'd be happy to talk with you. How about tomorrow evening? I have some things to share that might change how you see your situation. As I hit send, I realized that Helen had been right about having something valuable to offer. I had proof that transformation was possible, that limitations could be overcome, that women who'd been systematically undervalued could reclaim their worth in ways that seemed impossible until they weren't. The next morning, I woke up in my beautiful house and made coffee in my gorgeous kitchen and looked out at views that still took my breath away every single day. But more than the physical luxury, what filled me with satisfaction was the knowledge that I was living a life I'd chosen rather than a life I'd been forced to accept. Somewhere across town, in a modest apartment she could barely afford, Sarah Chen was probably waking up to another day of believing she had no options, no power, no right to expect anything better than what she'd been given. By tomorrow night, she'd know differently. The woman who had once been called too poor to understand why some people deserve nice things was about to help another woman discover that everyone deserves nice things. They just have to be brave enough to claim them. I picked up my phone and called Helen. "I'm in," I said when she answered. "When do we start helping Sarah?" "We start today," Helen said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Justice doesn't wait for convenient timing. As I hung up the phone and began planning my first conversation with Sarah Chen, I looked around my house one more time. Not the house that Brittany had dreamed of owning, not the house that Jake had planned to buy with stolen money, but my house. The house that represented everything I'd learned about my own worth and everything I was capable of achieving when I stopped accepting other people's limitations. The best part wasn't the marble countertops or the mountain views or the 3-car garage. The best part was knowing that this was just the beginning, that having reclaimed my own power, I was now in a position to help other women reclaim theirs. "Some people deserve nice things," Brittany had said, intending to exclude me from that category. She was right about that. Some people do deserve nice things. As it turned out, that category was much larger than she'd ever imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.